Greetings and welcome everyone. I am Alba Keita, the Portfolio Manager for Risk and Management at PECB. I'm excited to introduce to you today's topic of managing organizational influences on ISO 21500 implementation. The discussion will focus on organizational influences or factors like organizational structure, project environmental factors, and as well as process assets. You will have the opportunities to submit text questions to today's presenter by typing your questions into the questions pane of the control panel. You may send in your questions at any time during the presentation. We will collect these and address them during the question and answer session at the end of today's presentation. I would like now to introduce Mr. Oluseye Kolawole, an entrepreneur with keen interest in business process improvement and project management. He is a certified project management professional and an International Association of Safety Professional certified with Safety Manager Trainer. Now, without further ado, we will turn the time over to Oluseye. Thank you for your attention.
All right, good day everyone, and welcome to this presentation, as Albert said, on managing organizational influences on ISO 21500 implementation. My name is Oluseye Kolawole, and of course I'm a certified project manager as well as a certified lead risk manager, amongst other things. I welcome every one of us to this webinar. Okay, we will go through what our objectives will be for this presentation, and they include to help participants understand the structure of ISO 21500. To enumerate factors that influence the implementation of ISO 21500 within an organization, and to understand how to manage the impact of organizational structure on ISO 21500 implementation. One would immediately wonder why ISO 21500 is important and why it is needed. You would probably agree with me that projects happen to be one of the key elements for development. We typically like to say that for there to be any form of growth or improvement or development, one must embark on projects, because it is projects that take you from a point zero or a particular point where you are as an organization or as a nation or even as an individual to where you want to get to. For you to make that transition, you must embark on projects. And so the International Organization for Standardization, that is ISO, amongst the numerous standards and guidelines that they come up with, thought it good also to have a uniform standard, or you may call it guideline at this point, for project implementation within organizations. And that is why the ISO 21500 came about. So in this webinar, we're looking at how we're looking to enumerate what the standard is all about, and also to look at the factors that would influence your implementation of this particular standard within your organization. And that is because every organization is different. So when you bring the framework that ISO has created to your organization, there will be peculiar factors that will determine how it's going to work, or whether it's even going to work within your organization. And that's what we want to look at in our discussion today. Okay, so let's look at the structure of the ISO framework. Okay, that's the ISO 21500. One, the ISO 21500 provides a generic guidance on the concepts and processes of project management. It is recognized as a foundational reference for the application of project management knowledge and good practices, and it is one global standard for project management. So you can say that the ISO 21500 provides a guideline for organizations to implement project management within their organization. And it also serves as a reference material for the application of project management knowledge and good practices. You can say it gives you an idea of what you can implement as far as project management is concerned within your organization. Let's look at the content and the structure of the ISO 21500. Now, as you probably are aware, ISO documents usually come in clauses. So we have 4 clauses within this particular guideline. I should say at this point that the ISO 21500 is actually an informative document, or you could call it a descriptive document, meaning that it serves as a guideline, okay, for your implementation. It has not come yet to the point of being considered as a standard, which would mean it will be prescriptive. So what that means is that at this point, your organization would not be able to be certified to this particular standard as it is right now. So it is at a point where it just stands as a guideline for your organization to manage its project by. So going back to the clauses, we have 4 clauses. Clause 1, looking at the scope of this particular standard. Clause 2 looks at the terms and definitions. Clause 3 looks at project management concepts that have to do with the standard, and then clause 4 looks at the project management processes, and then there's the Annex A, which looks at processes mapped to the groups. Okay, let's go to the next slide and look at what clause 1 actually covers. Now, clause 1 covers the scope of ISO 21500, which includes the management of projects, as well as management of organizations most of the time. Okay, that is the management of projects in and most organizations most of the time. So clause 1 looks at what are those elements that need to be managed. Okay, so clause 1 looks at the scope of ISO 21500, and then we'll look at clause 2, which looks at the terms and definitions. Of course, one of the key purposes of ISO 21500 is to establish common definition
Hello again, everyone. I think Mr. Oluseye is having some audio problems, so please, we will just wait a few more seconds for him to take care of this. I apologize for this. Thank you.
Okay, I apologize for that. Yes, there was a network issue there. Okay, so I'll just go back to clause 1 and just pick it up from there. Okay, so I apologize for that. So I was looking at the clauses, of which we have 4 in the standard, and clause 1 talks about the scope, which covers the scope of ISO 21500. It looks at management of projects and how most organizations will manage projects most of the time. Okay, so it covers essentially what project management should be about. And then we look at clause 2, which looks at terms and definitions. And when we talk about terms and definitions, there are 16 project management terms that are covered in this particular clause 2. And these terms actually help to give a standard definition for some critical lingo, if you may call it that, for management of projects. And this is important because when you're managing projects across boundaries, across continents, and across countries, you want to be sure that you're all saying the same things. Okay, so the ISO 21500 gives certain definitions to help there to be uniformity across borders, across countries, as far as project management is concerned. So that's what clause 2 looks at. Then we'll go on to clause 3. Okay, clause 3 looks at project management concepts. This describes the concepts which play an important role during the execution of most of the projects. You will see the language being used in the ISO 21500 as it is usually with a lot of other ISO documents. It talks about, in most projects. So it is expected that most projects across most industries would be able to utilize this document within their organization. And so and that is the essence of this discussion, which is to say that yes, ISO has presented us with a document that can be used across most projects, okay, in most instances. However, how do you adapt it to your own organization? And if you're going to do that, how do you ensure that in adapting it to your own organization, you make a good success of it? So we have these concepts include projects, project management, organizational strategy and projects, project environment, project governance, project and operations, as well as stakeholder and project organization, and so on and so forth. These are some concepts that are looked at in clause 3. And then in clause 4, we look at the project management processes. As it is with a lot of project management methodologies, standards across the globe that already existed before the ISO 21500, the ISO 21500 also takes the process-based approach to the management of projects. And in doing that, the ISO 21500 identifies the recommended project management processes that should be applied on projects. And this consists of 5 process groups and 39 processes, which are divided into 10 project management themes called subject groups. We're going to quickly go through all of that so that we can, quickly get to the point, the crux of our discussion for today. And one of the definitions that we earlier talked about in clause 2 would be a project. So what is a project? A project, of course, is a unique set of processes consisting of coordinated and controlled activities with start and finish dates undertaken to achieve an objective. Achievement of the project objectives require deliverables conforming to specific requirements, including some constraints such as time, cost, and resources. And these is the ISO definition of what a project is. You would also note that this particular definition is similar to definitions from the PMI and some other organizations that have attempted to define what a project is. So that is what a project is: a unique set of processes consisting of coordinated and controlled activities, which is time-bound, which is aimed at fulfilling an objective, and which requires you to come up with deliverables that meet specific requirements while having constraints, attached to the project as well as the deliverables. Then another definition that we have in the ISO 21500 is project management. And project management is the application of methods, tools, and techniques and competencies to a project. Project management includes the integration of the various phases of the project life cycle, and project management is accomplished through processes. In this case, as far as the ISO 21500 is concerned, we achieve that using 39 processes. Okay? So we have project management being the application of methods, tools, techniques, and competencies to a project. And what we're discussing today is to say, how do we apply the processes that the ISO 21500 has recommended within our organization, considering that within the organization there will be several other things that influence how projects are accomplished within our organization. And this particular representation shows what we mean by a process, because like we said, ISO 21500 utilizes a process-based approach to the management of projects. So this is a depiction of a process. A process typically would have inputs, tools and techniques, and outputs, okay? Or you may call it inputs, what you use to turn your inputs into your outputs. That essentially is what a process is. So it means that ISO 21500 recommends that you utilize 39, as it were, of this type of activities or processes to actually deliver or implement your project from start to finish. And we're going to see some of these processes as we go on. We did talk earlier on about the fact that project management includes you having process groups. And so we have the process groups here, which include initiating, planning, implementing, controlling, and closing. Okay, so these are the process groups. And when we talk about process groups, we're saying the 39 processes that we mentioned earlier on that ISO 21500 recommends are actually grouped into the phases of the project in which they are utilized. And so we have them as initiating, planning, implementing, controlling, as well as closing. Then we also talked about the subject groups in the ISO 21500, and they include integration, scope, time, cost, quality, resource, stakeholder, communication, risk, as well as procurement. These are the areas that are seen that require to be managed across your project. So you would find out later on when we see the processes that come under each of these ones, of these subject groups, that there are areas that require management for your project to actually succeed. Okay, so we have them listed here. I'm not going to go through all of this. Essentially, we have processes under integration to include what we can see there. We have processes under scope. We have processes under time as well. Okay, and when we talk about the process, what essentially we're saying is that these are activities, project management activities that need to be carried out in order to accomplish your project objectives. So for instance, if you look at scope, that's number 2 on your screen, you will see that for you to be able to manage scope on the project, you are required, according to the guideline, to be able to define scope. Then you are also required to be able to create a WBS. WBS standing for work breakdown structure. Then you're also required to be able to define activities as well as control scope. These activities or these processes are what you require to be able to manage scope on your project. And that same concept goes for all the other 9 subject groups, meaning within the project, ISO 21500 says you should be able to manage integration using these processes underneath it, manage scope, manage time, and then when we go to the next slide, ISO 21500 requires you to be able to estimate cost, estimate cost, develop budget and control cost under cost, manage quality with these processes, manage resources as well. Then you also find that you're expected to be able to manage communication, manage risk, and manage procurement as well. And finally, manage stakeholders. These are the 10 subject groups, and you have the 39 processes underneath them. Okay, so we go to the big question of our discussion, which is organizational influences on the management of projects using ISO 21500. So what do we mean by organizational influence? Okay, the organizational environment within which a project is performed influences the project. The culture, the style and structure of the organization, as well as the organization's project management maturity and systems, have a great deal of impact on project success. What do we mean here? It means that the environment within which your project is existing has a huge impact on the outcome of that particular project. It means that within the organization within which the project is being carried out, okay, there are certain things that influence how the project is going to turn out. It also means that even outside that organization, so within the environment, probably it's the country, so that would include the regulatory environment, it would include even the climate, it would include the culture of that particular country or that particular area, it would include the market, market forces, and so on and so forth. All of these have a way of impacting on how your project is going to turn out. So the key question is this: how then do I implement ISO 21500 within my own peculiar environment? The first thing you need to know is that you need to understand what constitutes organizational influences. And I have some examples for us here. It says this includes variables external to the project environment. There are factors that make up the project environment. They include company culture and structure, government or industry standards, infrastructure, for example, the facility that is available for you or the facility within which you're carrying out your project, existing human resource, personnel administration, for example, hiring and firing guidelines, company work authorization system, market conditions, stakeholder risk tolerances, information system, and so on and so forth. Even though as we go on in this discussion, we're going to focus on organizational structure. Before we get to that point, I want us to realize that all of these external factors have an influence on how your project turns out. It also does mean that when you're implementing the ISO 21500, you're not just going to bring the framework or the guidelines and just implement as it is in your own organization. You must consider the peculiarity of your own project environment. For instance, regulations, the government regulations. You must consider the market conditions. You must consider the company culture. You must consider industry standards, and so on and so forth. But the one that we're going to consider, I'm going to focus on, like I said earlier on, is organizational structure. Okay? Now, this particular diagram shows the external influences, the external environment of the project organization. And when you look at it, you would see that this is your project organization, and this includes you implementing your project utilizing project management processes, product processes, as well as support processes to create the product of the project. Of course, you realize that for you to embark on a project, there would be a unique product that is meant to come out as the outcome. Okay, so we have the deliverables here, which will feed into operations, and the operations will continue to maintain that, until such a time that, there's the end of life of that particular product. But before then, you also need to consider other organizational factors that even bring about the need for that project, which is where we talk about the business case, and then where you come and then, implement the project. So all of these are actually external factors which are external to the project, but a lot of times are within the organization. But even outside of this, you also have those factors that are external to the project, to the organization within which the project is actually happening, and these factors also influence all of these. But the one we're focusing on today is going to be organizational structure. And then we say, remember this, why do we say, why are we going back to the process? Remember I said that you are going to be implementing your project according to 21500, utilizing the process-based approach. Now, you will find out for the input side of your processes, organizational influences would always come in as input into the processes. Why? Because there are things you must consider before you embark on the activities of the project. So as far as your process-based management is concerned, organizational influence would always serve as an input, and that's why I thought bring this back in here. Okay, so let's look at organizational structure and how they influence your management projects and implementation of ISO 21500. Okay, there's 6 key types of organizational structures: the functional, the weak matrix, the balance matrix, the strong matrix, project composite. Okay, and typically we call the functional structure the traditional organizational structure type, and that includes having the functional roles, you know, where you have your operations department, you have your human resource department, you have your engineering department, and all of those departments are set up in such a way that we have people that are in those disciplines and they disciplines. Okay, so that's the functional setup. Okay, and then we have at the other end of the spectrum what we will call the projectized. Okay, in the projectized setup, what you have essentially is you have project teams focused not on just achieving a functional goal, but project teams focused on achieving a specific product. Okay, that is the result of a particular project. Okay, so we have on one side of the spectrum functional and on the other side projectized, and some have the matrix organization. And I'm going to explain that as we look at the structures in the next few slides. Okay, so we have the functional role being shown in this particular diagram, or the functional organizational structure, wherein you have, like I explained earlier on, you know, functional manager. So this could stand for your human resource manager, this could stand for your engineering manager, and so on and so forth. And you have their teams, you know, reporting along functional lines. And in this kind of an organizational structure, if a project is going to be embarked upon, the project is going to be coordinated from and by the functional managers. They would have the authority, they would have the budget, and so on and so forth. But remember that the focus of these managers would primarily be their functional responsibility and functional goals. Okay, so the human resource manager will be focused on achieving human resource goals. The engineering manager will be focused on achieving engineering goals, and so on and so forth. But we do know that for projects to be implemented, they have to be implemented across functions. But in this case, because of the nature of these organizational structure, there will be some sort of difficulty, because naturally this organization is not set up for cross-functional cooperation. Okay, so that's the functional role. We're still going to come back to this and explain how this kind of structure is going to affect the implementation of ISO 21500 within the organization. Okay, then we have the weak matrix, which is a blend of the functional and the projectized, but with more influence of the functional role in there. Okay, so you have the weak matrix. In the weak matrix, you still have your functional roles within your organization. So you have the chief executive, and you have functional roles reporting to the chief executive. But then, in there, if a project is going to be done, then that project is going to be coordinated by team members within functional roles. Now, what this means is that project coordination is done at a lower level than the functional heads, but it's done across functions, and this implies that there's going to be little authority given to the people that are doing the coordination of the project. Okay, and then we'll go to the balance matrix. In the balance matrix, you still have the functional roles, being very strong, and the organization set up in the functional manner. However, you have a scenario whereby now you have a designated project manager. Even though that designated project manager still will be reporting to a functional manager. Okay, so you have that, and then there's coordination across functions. Okay, so let's go on. Okay, so we'll get to the strong matrix. By the time you come up with a strong matrix, you have a scenario whereby project management is being done across functions, but then there are now full-time dedicated project managers that report directly to a manager of project managers. In this case, project management no longer reports to functional managers, but then the project team members are still picked from the functional roles and then are brought into the project, and the project manager now reports to the manager of project managers. Just come along with me as I try to land this somewhere and give us an understanding of why it is important that when implementing ISO 21500 within your organization, a factor like organizational structure must be considered and must be taken seriously, because depending on the type of organizational structure that you have, you may not be able to actually get the true benefits of the processes and the subject groups and the entire ISO 21500 within your organization. Okay, so we have the projectized. In the projectized, all you have, like I explained earlier on, are just project managers. Okay, so you have project managers and you have project teams all over the organization, no functional roles in this case at all. Okay, and then you have the composite. The composite is a hybrid whereby there is an element of the strong matrix as well as the weak matrix. Okay, so this is where we're going essentially, which is a summary of how the organizational structure can actually have an impact on project implementation using ISO 21500 within the organization. Now, typically most organizations will set up as functional. If you remember how we describe the functional setup, wherein you have, silos, we call them. So you have the human resource department and so on and so forth, with the functional head and all of the disciplines within the human resource function. You expect them to be human resource experts or human resource practitioners, and then you go on to engineering and so on and so forth. You expect them to be engineers reporting to the head of engineering and so on and so forth. But you find out that for projects to actually be implemented, everyone in the project team needs to be time together, put their heads together, and walk through the 39 processes that we've mentioned. Okay, walk through the 5 process groups of initiating, planning, implementing, controlling, and closing. Okay, to be able to deliver on the project, just as we saw in the diagram that I showed us earlier on. Okay, but if your organization is structured in a functional manner, you will find that it's going to be difficult for project or for the process that you want implemented to be implemented as you would want them. Why? The reason is that the functional focus is going to be different from the project focus. So constantly you will find a scenario whereby the functional focus is always at variance with the project focus, and for the functional setup, the functional focus or the functional heads have more authority. Okay, and so they will continually work to benefit the functional focus of the functional goal, and as such, projects will suffer. So what it means is that the structure of the organization, if it is functional, when you bring in the ISO 21500 to implement, it is going to suffer. Why? Because the focus is always going to be on functional goals and not on project goals. Okay, so you move to the other end of the spectrum, which is projectized. if your organization is set up as a projectized organization, that is the organizational structure, then that is really, really going to favor project implementation, and ISO 21500 is going to work really well within such a structure. But the disadvantage of the projectized organization is always that when projects come to an end, then it means that the project team would not have any other thing to do. We typically say that the project team has no home in such a scenario. It means that, you know, there will not be anywhere within the organization for project team members to go back into. And so what happens is you need to let the project team go, and then when you have another project, you need to bring them up again, and so on and so forth. But that is why we have the matrix setup. Now, in the matrix setup, as you can see on the screen, we have the weak matrix, which has more influence of the functional, okay? And we have the strong matrix, which has more influence of the projectized, coming into mix with the functional. But we have the balance, which is a balance between the functional and the projectized. And the focus here is that if your organization is able for the implementation of ISO 21500, remember we're looking at organizational structure as one of those influences that are outside of the project organization that can influence the implementation of the 21500 standard. Okay. On the other hand, if your organization is functional, then be ready for trouble. Why do I say that? Because you're going to find that the functional role will keep focusing on functional goals, and projects will suffer. So the best the best structure, one may say, for you to have if you're looking at implementing the ISO 21500 would be to look at one of the matrix structures, okay? Preferably, especially if your organization is more project focused, then you should be looking at the balance to a strong matrix system. Why is this? Now let's look at the project characteristics vis-a-vis the organizational structures in this table. For instance, when you look at project manager authority, by nature of the functional structure, the project manager has little or no authority, and that can easily be seen in the diagram we saw earlier on, wherein project coordination, when it comes to the functional, is with the functional head. It means they hold the budget, they make the decisions, and so on and so forth. So it means that the project manager, whose focus is to get results out of the project, would not have such authority. Okay, so you have that project manager, and you have little, if any. But as you move towards the projectized, you see that the authority of the project manager continues to move from little to limited to high to total. Okay, and then resources available for project work. Okay, and the functional setup, it's literally none. Why? Because the functional roles have the power and they will consume the resources. But as you move to projectized, it becomes high to total. Who controls project spending? The same trend follows. Here you have the functional manager. At the weak matrix, you have the functional manager. At the balance, you have a mix. And then once you get into strong to projectized, it becomes the project manager. Then role as the project manager in the functional is part-time. In the weak matrix is also part-time, as we had seen in the diagram earlier on. By the time you get to the balance, then you have a full-time project manager who is focused on managing the project. And remember, these structures are already probably in organization, they already exist. So what it means is that when you bring in the ISO standard to implement within your organization, having the organization is already set up as functional. However, if it is projectized, we're always certain that it's going to thrive. Okay? And then as we wrap up, we have the project management support staff, also part-time here, part-time here, part-time here. That's from the functional to the balance matrix. And then you have them full-time at the strong matrix and full-time at projectized. So what we've said in essence is that the ISO 21500 is a guideline. It's made up of clauses, looks at the scope, looks at definitions, looks at the concepts, and also looks at the processes and the subject groups. Okay, and of course it follows a process-based approach to managing projects. And we've also said that in implementing the ISO 21500, it is important for us to realize that there must be consideration for organizational influences, okay, as well as external influences on how the project is being managed. And so we looked at the organizational structure as one of those influences to see how we can actually understand how the organizational structure affects how ISO 21500 is going to be implemented within our organization and the impact that it can have. And in closing, we have a summary of all that we have discussed. So for you to actually manage organizational influences on ISO 21500 implementation within your organization, one, you need to understand that the ISO 21500 provides generic guidance on project management. So it is generic. It is not a methodology. It is generic. You need to make it to suit your own environment and your own project environment. Number two is that you need to identify and understand the peculiar external factors to your project that can influence project delivery. And then you need to structure your organization to support projects and to support the 21500. And finally, in implementing project processes, always consider these organizational influences as inputs to your project. Thank you very much. Thank you for your time. I guess we'll take questions now.
Thank you, Oluseye, for this informative webinar. We're now going to begin answering the questions submitted during today's presentation. As a reminder, you can still submit questions through the questions pane in your attendee control panel. We have the first question here. What are the main differences between PMI and ISO 21500 standards?
Okay, thank you, Alba. Now, you would the ISO 21500 was actually created using inputs also and wide consultation with existing bodies like the PMI, the IPMA, and so on and so forth. Okay, so the key difference would be in the number of processes, for instance. So in the PMI, which is the PMBOK standard, there are 47 processes, whereas in the ISO there are 39. Okay, both of them also have 10 subject groups, where in the PMI standard it is called knowledge areas. Apparently, the PMI, when the 5th edition of the PMBOK was actually updated, and we have the 5th edition, they tried to align with the ISO standard. So that's why you see a lot of similarities. So before now, in the 4th edition of the PMBOK, you had 9 subject groups or knowledge areas, but then when they did the update, they also tried to align, because the ISO is seen as a global standard. Okay, so they also tried to align with it. So if you're looking for the differences are minor. Okay, of course, one of the very clear differences will be the number of processes, but the approach remains the same. So I would say it's more similar than different. So outside of the number of processes, it's essentially the same, I would say. And there's an attempt actually for there to be alignment. So that's why you find it being so the same. Yes.
Thank you very much for your answer. It was very clear. The next question is, what is more important, scope, quality, or cost?
That's between the devil and the deep blue sea, isn't it? Now, when you look at that, as far as project management is concerned, you will need to look at it from the standpoint of the customer. Okay? So when you look at scope, quality, and cost, it will depend on what your customer wants. So if your customer is more focused on cost, as a project manager, you focus on the need of the customer, because the success of your project is determined by your customer. Okay, so if the customer's focus is on cost, then the project focus is on cost. So if your customer's focus is on quality to the detriment of cost and scope, let's assume, then your focus as a project manager would also be on quality. So when you look at it from the standpoint of what we call the triple constraint, okay, which could include scope, cost, quality, in some instances time, okay, you find that your decision on which is most important would always be what the customer wants. So if you throw the customer into that mix, so you will say what is most important is actually the customer.
Thank you very much. Yeah. And now, because of the time...
Are you there?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Great. So now, because of the time limitations, we will answer to the last question, which is, do you know any project management software?
Oh, there are quite a number of project management softwares, but you find that you can't call them project management softwares in that sense because they do not do all of the project management for you. A lot of time, so typically when people say project management software, you're looking at maybe your MS Project, your Primavera, and so on and so forth. But what they do basically is they help you to plan as well as to monitor, you know, some aspects of your project. But there's some aspects, for instance, that still need to be done, okay, outside of those softwares, if you call it that way. For instance, your Primavera has some aspect of risk management, you know, that it can do for you. MS Project does not have that. For instance, yes, you can do some procurement, some planning of your procurement on these softwares, but the actual procurement still needs to be done outside of those and all of that. But you also have some SAS softwares, you know, that helps you to manage your team, like the Clarizen, the Rike, and all of that. So there are quite a number of softwares out there that you can use. So so you have, in one instance, the planning tools. So let's call them the planning tools, the Primavera, the MS Project, and similar tools like that. But on the other hand, you also have enterprise management, you know, softwares like your, like I said, your Clarizen, your Rike, and all of that. So those are some softwares that can help you with your management. But of course, you realize that one of the skills you must have as a project manager is also what you may call soft skills. So there's a lot of that will need to be done outside of the software, which is also important to do a lot of human interface to be able to succeed as a project manager.
Thank you very much for your time, Oluseye. Yeah. Is there anything else you wanted to cover before we wrap up?
I think that will be it. Just to state that it's important that the organizational influences are looked at, because you find that a lot of times we set up the organization and we want to do projects without considering whether the organization is project friendly. So when you're doing projects, look at your organization, whether the setup of the organization, the structure of the organization is project friendly, because it can make a lot of difference in your project success or failure. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you to all the attendees. We appreciate you being here. I want to inform you that this webinar is also recorded and can be found in our website and YouTube channel. We'll also send you the link of the webinar in your email in the upcoming days. Don't forget to check back on our upcoming webinars on topics of your interest by visiting our website www.pcb.com. Thanks again for joining us today, and we will see you next time, same day at the same time. Bye.